Welcome to EHO Knows, the podcast for environmental health officers. My name's Shane, and today we're going to be looking at floods again. But in our earlier episode, we were looking at what happens when the floodwaters are still rising and you're in those hours and days immediately after the flood. Now we're going to take a step back and we're going to be looking at someone's journey weeks after the event, and it's when the cleanup's starting to happen and big decisions are happening to the future of a township. So to take us through that journey, I've got Andrew Waters with us. Welcome, Andrew.
Good morning, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Now, not many people know you, so let's introduce you to the world. So what's your background?
Okay. I started my working life in a factory and then got an apprenticeship as a mechanic. I worked as a mechanic for a good few years. Tiring of that, I was fortunate enough to be accepted to go back to uni and study physiotherapy. And I worked as a physiotherapist for a good number of years as well. My career moved on from physiotherapy into health service management, and I worked in the Kimberley and in the Pilbara in the southeast of South Australia, based in Mount Gambier and based in Rockhampton. Was approaching retirement age, and having had a few career changes along the way, I wondered if there was one more that I could incorporate into my working life. And so after a year I settled on the graduate diploma in environmental health practice at Flinders University in Adelaide. That was 2013. I was accepted into that course and promptly got a job back in the Kimberley and returned here in 2014 and completed the course in 2015. And then in 2018, aged 60, I decided that it was time to retire, still having never used my environmental health qualification. So a job came up at the Shire of Broome, or a vacancy, and I was egged on to apply by some of my colleagues. Remarkably, was appointed to the position with no experience, which did surprise me a bit. So I worked there until 2023, 2022, and retired again. And then the person who took my job fell pregnant, and I went back to cover her maternity leave. And 2.25 years on, I'm still at the Shire of Broome and loving every minute of it.
And so today's story is actually going to be from after you came back, and well, your career is going to go on forever. You're never going to escape now. So this one's about a flood in Fitzroy River. So before we dive in, tell us a little bit about the geography of, first of all, Broome, and then specifically moving across to Fitzroy River.
Okay, Shane. Kimberley's a huge place. I think they say it's twice the size of Victoria. It has 4 local government authorities, one of which is the Shire of Broome and one of which is the Shire of Derby West Kimberley. And the Shire of Derby West Kimberley is where the Fitzroy Valley is, and Fitzroy Crossing is a little town, probably less than 1,000 people in that valley. It's about 400 kilometres from Broome. Broome itself is about 2,200 kilometres from Perth, and it's 1,800 kilometres from Darwin.
Sorry, I was just going to say, in context for thousands of overseas subscribers, just imagine we're now talking about the top northwest corner of Australia. The majority of population lives on the east coast. Everyone forgets about Western Australia. And right up the top, like if you were to drive those distances in Europe, you will have driven through most of Europe by the time you've managed to do from Perth up to Broome or from Broome across to Darwin. So we're just talking about a huge amount of space, but it can pretty much be summarized with a lot of nothing. Like we've packed a huge amount of nothing into a huge amount of space. Fair summary of the area?
I think that's, fair summary.
So this is tourism speaking here. Yeah, come and see nothing. You can spend ages seeing nothing. And so that's part of the challenge, because you've now got this remote township. So why does this township exist in the first place?
I think probably exists from the background of bringing traditional living Aboriginal people out of the desert and into the Western way back in the 50s and 60s. And so the town was a point where the 4 main language groups were brought in together as colonisation spread through Australia. So I don't know the exact history, but Fitzroy Crossing, the township, was established many years ago. Its economy really is largely from government employee income and government service delivery.
Yeah. So we're talking about a small community, but the majority of the jobs are there because of government spending, trying to look after the local community. So we're not talking about an agricultural hub. We're not talking about a tourist mecca. We're talking about a small town that just exists halfway between nowhere and nowhere. So it's a township that in one sense is there for purpose but struggling to be there. And so there's no local council. So the floods happen and then the waters recede. And then what happens?
So, yeah, the flood was unprecedented, it has to be said. I think it rose 1.75 metres above the bridge over the Fitzroy in Fitzroy Crossing, and that had never happened before, and it did destroy the bridge and isolate the town. And so there was rain through the Fitzroy Valley, which is the catchment for the Fitzroy River. It washed away river level monitoring gauges. It was so intense, and the town had to be evacuated under emergency conditions. It wasn't like people knew the floodwater was coming down the river. It just rose around them. Not only rose, flowed through the town as well. So you have not only flood inundation, but the effects of flowing, reasonably fast flowing water as well on built structures. In the days following, obviously there was the evacuation and the resettlement or relocation of the whole of the town. It happened on about January the 2nd or 3rd. So many of these of the local agencies would have been away from town, enjoying Christmas and New Year in their hometown. So many of the houses were empty of people, but still fully furnished, fully stocked with food and locked up. The floods went through. They pretty much damaged everything from the water supply infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, the houses themselves, supermarket, all those areas were flood affected.
And so there's no one there. The waters come back down again, and then the cleanups start. So SES is called in to assist. But then why environmental health officers?
Good question. And I think more so now authorities are realising the importance of environmental health response within an emergency response. One of the directors of the Shire of Derby West Kimberley, who is a former EHO, was emphatic that Department of Fire and Emergency Services needed guidance from environmental health professionals on entering houses, assessing flood damage, making decisions about what needed to be thrown out, where people needed protective equipment, personal protective equipment, those sorts of things. So not any structural damage, and there was structural damage in a number of places, but generally speaking, there wasn't structural damage to the housing in the town. So why environmental health? The houses had been locked up. Some of them we couldn't get into initially because they were locked up. So there's the risk of mould, there's the risk of whatever gets washed up in the floodwaters and then settles within the houses. That can be hazardous. There's the putrefying food in the fridges and waterlogged food in pantries. So there was a team of rotating environmental health staff so that there was 7-day-a-week cover to support the SES volunteers, other emergency services workers as they went about their work, trying to not restore but ensure that the properties didn't undergo further deterioration following the floods.
So like I said in the intro, this is stepping in afterwards, and it's the long process of actually deciding what do we do next. So you're brought in. What do you see as you enter the town for the first time?
The roads were cut on both sides of the town for quite some time, and cut between Broome and Derby as well. So to get to Fitzroy Crossing by road, one has to go to Derby at least and turn off just before Derby and then head on to Fitzroy Crossing. So those roads were cut and severely cut. We're used to roads being cut up here, but very quickly main roads restore us or what have you. So we had to fly into Fitzroy Crossing. I think the stark thing was the military presence at the airport. So the Air Force had taken over the airstrip, so there are military aircraft there. The stark Fitzroy River Bridge destroyed, which I'm sure many listeners will have seen photos of. And the fact that other than that, damage didn't look too bad from the air. The floodwaters, by the time I got there, which was mid to late January. Much of the floodwater had subsided. There was still some standing water around, but the damage wasn't evident. And being wet season, the vegetation's very green and it just looks lush and inviting until you hit the ground.
Just to highlight the importance of the roads, it's not like there's 1,000 roads leading into this place. It's now literally just cut off from civilization in both directions. You're flown in, and in fact, you're staying not in town because it's not fit for habitation. Whereabouts were you staying?
A tourist accommodation place called Fitzroy River Lodge, which is on the other side of the river from the town, and it built on an elevated platform in effect, and it had been bared the floods. I think the flood waters got up to about the bearers but didn't enter the accommodation units themselves. But the rest of the grounds had been severely impacted. Anyway, that had been spared. And so all the relief workers were able to be accommodated there. And in an emergency response, there's nothing spared to ensure that supplies are maintained. So we're fed our breakfast and dinner, but the trip from the accommodation to the office, in effect, was a 2.5-minute helicopter ride. So that was an interesting experience.
Yes. So what would have been just a quick 5-minute drive, you needed helicopters just to get around. But that's really the scale of devastation where you can't even get from one side of town, just out of town, back in again. It was that isolated. Okay, so you're going to be inspecting houses as well as everything else. What were the houses like as you started entering them?
Fitzroy Crossing is actually pretty much on the banks of the Fitzroy River, so it had been impacted quite significantly. And for the houses that we went into, the water, by stormwater or floodwater ranged from probably a couple of centimetres or a few centimetres over the floor to probably about 1.75 metres up the wall. In some of the houses, perhaps even close to 2 metres. So everything within the property is flood affected, and when I was there the floodwaters had subsided. The houses that had been locked up, a couple of centimetres of dense sticky mud on the floor, and that was part of the assessment, was their slip, trip, fall hazards. And then of course in a tropical climate like the Fitzroy Valley, there's the mould issue, there's the damage to the white goods, the furnishings, to everything really. Yeah, the houses we went into, most of them had been severely impacted, and a couple of them were actually above the flood level, so they hadn't been inundated directly. They had been otherwise damaged by vandalism because they'd been unoccupied for some time prior. So that was a bit of frustration really, that houses that could otherwise perhaps have been used by flood-affected people were not inhabitable because of the damage from vandalism.
Which gets back to the social economic problems that already existed beforehand. So you're walking into these houses, what's the smell like in them?
I was forewarned to take Vicks with me, like your CSI and other shows where they go into sites where there's decomposing animals. Didn't need it, I have to say. The smell was pretty ripe in a number of places, but not really. For me, it wasn't really that bad. I did have an experience with the Occupational Health and Safety Coordinator for the SES where we went to I think it was the showgrounds or the rodeo grounds, and I was going into some of the outbuildings there, including the ablutions, and in the height of the floods, animals had become trapped in some of these buildings, like the public toilets, for example. They'd become trapped in there and died. And I walked in there and I was aware of the smell, but the OSH person reeled away dry retching and wouldn't come into any buildings with me after that. He just asked me to shout out what my findings were. So That was rather entertaining for me because, I don't know, I guess I was a bit used to some of those unpleasant smells that you get in this job.
So one of the benefits you get from EHO is you're just exposed to bad smells. So there's one of those hidden qualifications where you go, yeah, dead bodies, I'm okay with that. That's just funny. Yeah, you're prepared to go somewhere where someone else is going, no, I don't want any surprises. And so you're going into these houses to work out whether or not they're safe to be occupied. How many of them were actually given the tick that, yes, this is all fine? Or how many of them were you just walking out going, no, this is not going to be fit for occupation?
I don't recall going into a single house that I thought was okay to be reoccupied with a bit of a mop of the floor and reset the furniture or replace the fridge. I don't think I went into a single house that was ready for immediate reoccupation. They had all been flood affected to a significant level or otherwise vandalised.
So it's not like you're walking in and going, yes, we can make this fit. You're actually going in with a really negative message. What were you doing with the contents of these houses now?
This was before I arrived in the town, but initially the instructions for the volunteer emergency workers was that they were to empty the fridges and then take the putrefying food out onto the verge and then take the white goods out onto the verge. But quite quickly, the quality of the putrefying food deteriorated such that it really wasn't safe for them to be emptying the fridge. So they were just taping them shut and taking them out onto the verge. When I got there, the houses that I was going to had not been assessed prior to my arrival, and it was a similar thing. The fridges, many of them had just burst open with the putrefying food, and they were basically laid on their back so that it all sloshed back inside and taped shut and carried out by the volunteer services workers. It was a number of houses that I went into. These were ones that had been boarded up because their occupants had flown south for the floodwaters had come in, and all the furnishings had just floated around in the rooms, and sometimes they'd landed against the door. The lounge suites had floated around and just settled where the floodwaters subsided. One house I went into, it had a ceramic cooktop, and the mould on it was not millimetres, that's an exaggeration, but probably a millimetre thick. It was just horrendous, the mould. That became the prevailing experience, really, was the proliferation of mould in these wet, dark, closed up houses.
So part of the value that you were adding was actually looking after the health and welfare of the volunteers who were coming in. So the decisions as to what to do with rotting stuff or identifying the risks. So there's that short-term benefit, but then at the same time, you're now condemning these houses. There was one incident in particular with a person who was in a wheelchair. And so they've had the friends and family attempt to clean up the house, and you're now stepping into this house which they're waiting for the green light to move back in. What happened there?
Yeah, that was a bit of a difficult moment, really, because this was a house in the town and it was occupied by someone with a disability who was in a wheelchair. And family and friends had rallied behind them and they had cleaned this house up inside. And I don't know that I can portray or present a picture of what the houses looked like when we went into them, the ones that had been left vacant until we got there. As I said before, there's a couple of centimetres of dense, slippery mud or silt on the floor. Who knows what is within that silt, from animal feces to who knows what. And in this house, they had cleaned it impeccably. The cupboards, the shelving, the floors, the walls, they were all spotless. And my outward appearances were ready. The house was ready to be occupied.
This is also a house that would have been modified to make it suitable for this person. So you've got a person who is disabled, who is now probably in a house that's not ideally suitable for them. And so the family and friends have put in all this effort to help them move back into their own home. And it's now immaculate. It's clean, it's looking good, and you step in.
And I step in and I have a look around, and as I say, it had been cleaned throughout, from laundry to bathroom to all the living areas. Even the grounds had been hosed off and were reasonably clean and clear of flood debris. Were smiling, saying, "So can we move back in now?" And I said, "No, you can't, because of the height of the inundation. The electricals will be damaged. You can't move back in because you won't have an electricity supply." There were aids for people with disabilities, such as an electric controlled bed. That wouldn't work if it had been brought back in because the electricity wasn't on and couldn't just simply be switched on because the house looked clean. They said, "But what else do we need to do?" And I said, "You've done a fantastic job. You've it's remarkable the effort you've put in, given what I'd seen in the same street. And they were very keen, and I understand it. Dignity and privacy of people is important, and much of it is taken away in an emergency response. So this person wanted to get back in and have their quality of life as they knew it reinstated, their dignity, their privacy, all those things restored, as opposed to living in an evacuation centre or emergency accommodation. So they pleaded with me to be able to stay, and I was weakening to a degree. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, if they reoccupy this house, it'll become one of the last to have the hidden flood damage addressed. And I was on the verge of saying, okay, yes, you can move back. And I leaned against the wall and pushed my fingers, probably out of tension, pushed my fingers into the plaster or into the wall. It sunk into the plaster, which was still wet from behind. And I just thought, no, that was the sealer for me, that it was unsafe for this person to move back in. And while they could have lived there with probably some reasonable life satisfaction, the underlying damage was still there. The mould could come back, and the preconditions for mould would exist in the wall cavity. And as I said, they would probably go to the back of the queue in terms of having their property renovated or restored. So I just held my line and said, I can't approve that. And they accepted it. And yeah, I went on to the next property and they considered their options from there, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so it's a really tough call because it looks good, but within weeks, you'll now have a mold problem. And there's no power, so it's not like they can do anything to dry the place out or have good airflow or whatever. So tough call. So you're going through house after house, condemning them, even the ones that are looking good. But what you're doing is stopping people returning into a place that's going to give them medium, long-term health issues because they're just not fit for habitation in the first place. You've also got another story where you had some small community that was just outside of town. So what happened there?
Yeah, with the emergency response, the town and the outstation communities were put into sectors, and we systematically went through each sector. So there was an outstation was a group of about, I think, 6 or 8 houses, probably about 5 kilometres out of town by a dirt road and equally close to the river as the township itself. And those people who lived there had been evacuated under emergency conditions or situation, and we were going back to their houses, and we had a very tight window to get in, assess the houses and get out, and we were taking an occupant from each of the house with us. The plan was to drive in, but it started raining and there were real fears that the road would be cut off and then we would be isolated in there until the flooding subsided again. So we went in by helicopter and we flew in the rain, and it's noisy in a helicopter. And there was myself and another EHO, and I think from memory, 5 or 6 people from this community. And we had to find a place to land. So we kind of hovered around and flew around a water tower and was all a bit something out of a movie. But finally, the pilot found somewhere to land where there wasn't overhanging branches and no obstructions or obstacles. But it was probably 400 metres or so from the houses themselves. So we set off in this drizzly rain and we were in our equipment, clothed, but the people from that community were pretty much dressed in whatever they had salvaged at the time they left. And they were all in thongs, and we're walking in on this muddy road and their thongs are sticking in the mud. So they kick their thongs off and we continue to walk in bare feet. And I thought, this is just a recipe for a disease outbreak. And many listeners will be aware there's been an outbreak of melioidosis in coastal Queensland with the rain they've had, and it enters through a breach of the skin. And here's these people walking in bare feet. And I was horrified, to be honest. But there was nothing we could do. As we walked in, having seen a number of flood affected homes, I started talking to them and asking, do you know what to expect when you get here? And they really didn't know because they had been evacuated under such urgent conditions. So I just talked to them to say there'll be mud on the floor, there'll be silt lines up the wall, the house will be damaged, all your furnishings will be damaged. You're going in to salvage what you can. And because we went in by helicopter, there wasn't a lot of loading that the helicopter could take back. So the instructions were, get the belongings that you want to keep and put them on the kitchen table, and they will be retrieved later. That's how much was expected to be left to people's belongings. So anyway, we continued walking, and I continued talking, saying that it'll be some time before you can get back to your house to live in it. The damage will be extensive. Your belongings, or almost all your belongings, will be gone, etc. And so we got to these houses, and they clearly had been flood affected, and myself and Evie, the other EHO, we split up, and she went with some of the property occupants and I went with the others. And we'd go into these houses, and the people would walk around and gather their belongings. And because of the height of the floods, about the only belongings they could salvage were the paintings and photos on the wall. That was really about it. And so they gathered up those memorabilia and artefacts and left them on the kitchen table. And then I would hurriedly go off to the next property. As I said, we had a limited time frame get this job done because of the scheduling of the helicopters. And I just thought to myself, I'm not going to rush this. This is these people's lives in their houses. You can't just say, oh, time's up, mate, let's go. So I didn't rush the exercise, and I let them have time to themselves to reflect and gather their thoughts and what have you. And we got through all the houses when the floodwater subsided and the road was safe for the emergency services to come in and basically pressure hose the houses out. There were, a centimetre or two of slippery mud on the floor. The other sort of heartwarming moment, if you like, is as we walked into this community, the two of us and the 5 or 6 community people, their dogs came out of the bush. So their dogs had survived the floods for 2.5 odd weeks. And when they heard people come into the community, they came back to meet their owners. So that was pretty heartwarming, I have to say. And obviously we couldn't take the pets back on the helicopter, but Evie, my colleague, did go back with dog food and leave dog food there until things were a bit more secure and people could get in there. So that was pretty heartwarming. And the other story from that community was the houses were all dark. They'd all been shuttered up. And I walked in, and I did have a torch, but even battery life and things, used it sparingly. And I walked into a room and I saw a snake on the floor in the darkness, in the mud. And I reeled back defensively. And when I shone my torch on it, it was actually a necktie. But in the gloom, it looked like the scales of a snake coiled on the floor. So that's a little story that I've told a few people.
But it just highlights the fact that every single room you're stepping into was a step into the unknown. You couldn't guarantee your safety. So, So you're fortunate it was a tie and not a snake. A good excuse to ban ties worldwide. And so having talked to these on the way in, they've now gone into their houses, and sure enough, it's that bleak outcome of you can't take anything short of the photos or whatever. So what was their feedback to you afterwards, after that?
Wasn't really the opportunity, because I talked to them on the way in and I would make conversation when I was in the houses. I think really they were taken aback by what they saw, having already lived for 2.5 odd weeks in some sort of emergency accommodation. They really didn't have a lot to say. And in response to the lack of response, I tried to make conversation around not helping them plan for the future, far from it, but letting them know that the houses would be restored, but there would be a time lapse. It would take quite some time, letting them know that the water supply was compromised. And so even if they came back prior to any restoration works, they wouldn't have water, etc., etc. So I don't know how much it made a difference to them. I would like to think that it did. It's a traumatic experience, as you've uncovered in a previous podcast. So, I hope that they had a softer landing going into their house than they would have otherwise had if they'd been chucked off and trotted in and grab your stuff and let's go.
Yeah, because you're going through a really hard bit, and what's the future like? And so one of the big value that you can provide is, in one sense, not pull your punches and actually just lay it out as to this is what you're going to be walking into. And so they're prepared. And unfortunately, it's still going to be tough. It's still going to be hard, but it's much, much better to know that you're going to be stepping into a house filled with mud and everything's destroyed than suddenly just rocking up. You're not going to be living on that false hope of next week will be all back to normal. Over all of that, what were the highlights and what were the lowlights that stood out for you?
I think the highlights were not being thrown in because we chose to do it, but being put in amongst a bunch of people who you don't know, who have a common purpose but with a different skill set, and just mucking in. The significant majority of the population in Fitzroy Crossing and its outstations is Aboriginal. The houses we went into we gained approval to go into them through a cultural broker, in effect. So, someone who could speak on our behalf but had credibility and respect from the occupiers of all the houses. Seeing those guys work tirelessly to go to any length to try and find the owner or occupier of a house that we wanted to get into and assess. Those guys worked tirelessly, and I took my hat off to them. The SES workers who are in their personal protective clothing, that thick, airproof, heat-proof thing that they wear, and we're in like up to 40-degree temperature, blazing sun much of the time, and like 70 to 90% humidity. It's really oppressive conditions. And these guys just mucked in and they worked. They carted fridges out and lounge suites and heavy stuff. Then they'd get behind the pressure hose and hose these places out. And they'd come back to the emergency centre and they'd get a sandwich and a can of soft drink and sit round and have a laugh. And that sounds a bit off to have a laugh, but humour in times of stress is often the best reliever. Yeah, it was that teamwork, that the people from DFES were fantastic. It was just a really enriching experience. And I do have to say, when I landed there and got to the emergency coordination centre, I walked in and there was a big whiteboard on a table up against a wall where everyone went past, and big letters that had hazards. Underneath it had extreme heat, high humidity, dead animals, and at the bottom someone had written snapping handbags, which is a euphemism for freshwater crocodiles. So
Okay.
yeah, and listeners might want to Google freshwater crocodile in Fitzroy Crossing flood, and the footage there is very entertaining of a police officer with a resort trying to subdue a freshwater crocodile, and when he throws the tip of the crocodile, it just goes ballistic, is the only word I can use. So it's worth Googling to see. But again, that's the sort of hazards that could have been there. The saltwater crocodile was found at 2 a.m. or something, strolling up one of the streets in the township. And as well as that, there were lots of dead animals around that had been treated with lime, etc.
I was just going to say, for our international viewers, it is normal practice for crocodiles to walk down the street in Australia, and children from about the age of 5 are taught how to wrestle crocodiles. So, yeah, it's just an everyday occurrence, nothing special, move right along.
But don't try this at home.
Yeah. And so then the low points.
I'm not convinced there were low points, but it was emotionally demanding. As I say, the person with a disability and trying to return home and visiting the houses and the dogs coming out of the bush. It's emotionally demanding. For me, it was a enriching experience. It made me appreciate environmental health even more, just the dynamic of environmental hazard identification and control to the human factor engagement with people who are affected or perpetrating, as often happens in our mainstream life of doing regulated business inspections. But yeah, it made me appreciate just how capable we need to be to do our jobs well.
Yes, and it's unfortunate that it's at the bleakest moments where your skills really rise to the forefront. So you're there telling people that they can't move back into their homes, but what you're really saying is, hey, your health is on the line here, and so you can't see it. And you talked about the pleasure guilt where you're using your skills and this is awesome and you've got such a golden opportunity, But to think of it as an opportunity to be using your skills when it's at the cost of people's houses and all their memories and all that sort of stuff. But the truth is, that's what you're there for. You're there to look after communities at lowest point and making sure that they do remain as safe as possible, that there is a path into the future that is much, much better than where it is at the moment. And so in the end, how many weeks were you there for?
I think I did one rotation of, it might have been 6 or 7 days, and pretty much the environmental health team in the Shire of Derby, West Kimberley, they started out at the start of the floods once the town could be not reoccupied but revisited, were there continuously, but environmental health officers from the Shire of Halls Creek adjoining to the north and the Shire of Broome adjoining to the south were deployed on a rotating basis. So I did one rotation. My colleague from Shire of Broome, Rachel Donovan, she did 2 rotations. And by the time we got to the end of January, that immediate response need had been met from an environmental health perspective, and really it was on into the recovery phase, which was undertaken by other agencies. So yeah, it was about a week, and that's it.
Yes. And any tips for an environmental health officer who's stepping into a similar sort of role?
I think, yeah, a couple of tips, Shane. Before I landed in Fitzroy Crossing, my colleague Rachel had already done a swing there. And when she got back, I said, "What's it like? What were you doing, etc." And she said, and all of that. And she said, "Andrew, just remember, stay in your lane. So do what you're good at, which is environmental health. Don't worry about logistics. Don't worry about supply chains. Don't worry about workforce requirements or resource allocation. Don't get into any politics if there is any. Just stick with environmental health and do that well." So stay in your lane is a metaphor that sticks with me, I have to say. And the other thing that I came away thinking, because I went in thinking, what do I know about this? I don't know anything about this. But I came away thinking, if you're an environmental health professional, in those situations, back yourself. You've got skills and knowledge that are unique to what we do in our professional life. We really are generalist practitioners. We're not specialists by and large, but we've got a broad range of skills. And we talked a bit about the damage to the houses themselves, but it's the more subtle things as well about damage to on-site wastewater systems. Parts of them are damaged, parts of them are washed away. The longer term effects of a damaged on-site wastewater system, that it becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And mosquito breeding in the valley after the floods was, I believe, simply horrendous. Again, the various outstations in the township are reliant on that comes through a UV sanitizer, filtration and UV sanitizer. They weren't working, and they were going to take time to get replacement parts in. And you could go into the town or into the houses, turn the tap on, the water would run, but there's no assurance at all that it's safe. You do have skills, observational skills required of your job, and scientific understanding that lets you apply those bits and pieces to protect people, in their environment, basically.
Yes. So stick to your lane, but just realize that your lane is actually a wide lane and you're actually bringing a lot to the overall project. So I thought it was interesting that you talked about the highlight was working with all these other teams. The piece of advice, though, is stick to your lane so that don't tread on toes, don't enter the politics or whatever, but then at the same time, realize that your contribution is valuable, your skills are absolutely essential, and you will bring in insights that others just are totally unaware of. So you've got all these unconscious competencies. And so, yeah, I love that as a summary.
Yeah, perhaps just another thing on disaster response and emergency response. We had bushfires in south of Perth several years ago, where a whole heap of treated pine or treated timber went up in smoke and liberated toxic fumes. And environmental health professionals were involved in that, checking to see that the plume of smoke but checking to see that there was no human harm from the toxic smoke. We had Cyclone Seroja here several years ago that hit Kalbarri, which is a town north of Perth, a long way south of here, not built to cyclone standards. And like many older towns in around the country had houses built of cement sheeting with asbestos containing materials, and that was fragmented and shattered. And again, environmental health response to ensure that's managed safely in the cleanup and disposal. So again, the breadth of skills that we have and the breadth of work that we're expected to do or have a role in doing is quite remarkable, really.
Yes, it's absolutely awesome. And part of the reason for the podcast is to actually just highlight the valuable contribution that you make every single day. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you again for being on the podcast, and all the best.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks for doing the podcast. I think it's a great contribution. And yeah, I've listened to every episode so far. I'm not sure I'll listen to this one, but I'll wait for the ones following.
You'll listen to this one 3 times. Anyway, thanks a lot.